Revelation 6 seemed to be an exact allegorical representation of the eclipse of 59 CE, and since this was the earliest event described in the book, it was safe to assume that the entire book was probably written because of the eclipse. That's not to say that the other authors had any clue what Revelation 6 was. Rather, the allegory was so unusual and esoteric that it encouraged further writing. And in Revelation 12, there was a relatively clear representation of the eclipse of 71 CE. By the time I'd gotten through Revelation 12, I had serious questions that simply couldn't be answered inside the confines of the modern Bible. Astrology and eclipses were simply something that had not occurred to me before reading that book, yet here were two chapters that were purely astrological. Now, since that time, I've wandered around and occasionally ventured into ancient astrology to see what I could find, but for the most part, I put that concept on the back burner. Today, however, I was reading up on the concept of the Trinity, and once again, astrology reared its ugly head. Theophilus of Antioch was the first person to mention the concept of the Trinity. Now, it should be noted that Theophilus wrote somewhere around 170 CE, and that he's largely speaking to a Greek audience. In Book 2, Theophilus is explaining the problems of Homer and Hesiod and advocating for the Jewish version of creation. Theophilus is literally arguing against Hesiod's theogony and the works of Homer. Clearly, Hesiod and Homer were still important at the time. Now, there are several interesting things about Theophilus' Book 2, and I would encourage anyone to read this. However, in this video, I'm focusing on Chapter 15 alone. In Chapter 15, Theophilus describes the events of the fourth day of the Genesis creation. On the fourth day, the luminaries were made because God, who possesses foreknowledge, knew the follies of the vain philosophers, that they were going to say that these things which grow on the earth are produced from the heavenly bodies, so as to exclude God. In order, therefore, that the truth might be obvious, the plants and seeds were produced prior to the heavenly bodies. For what is posterior cannot produce that which is prior. And these contain the pattern and type of a great mystery, for the sun is a type of God, and the moon of man. And as the sun far surpasses the moon in power and glory, so far does God surpass man. And as the sun remains ever full, never becoming less, so does God always abide perfect, being full of all power and understanding and wisdom and immortality and all good. But the moon wanes monthly, and in a manner dies, being a type of man. Then it is born again, and is crescent for a pattern of the future resurrection. In this manner also the 3 days which were before the luminaries are types of the Trinity, of God and His Word and His wisdom. And the fourth is a type of man, who needs light, and so there may be God, the Word, wisdom, man. Wherefore also on the fourth day the lights were made. The disposition of the stars, too, contains a type of the arrangement and order of the righteous and pious, and of those who keep the law and commandments of God. For the brilliant and bright stars are an imitation of the prophets, and therefore they remain fixed, not declining nor passing from place to place. And those which hold the second place in brightness are types of the people of the righteous, and those again which change their positions and flee from place to place, which are cared planets. They too are a type of men who have wandered from God, abandoning His law and commandments. In this passage, the sun is the perfect representation of God. The moon, with its dying and resurrecting, is the perfect representation of man, and the stars are two things. There are bright stars, which represent ancient prophets, and all the other stars represent righteous people. The planets are wanderers. The planets are lost people. The entire afterlife of early Christianity appears in the sky. God, man, the prophets, dead people, lost people. Heaven is the sky. Some might claim that Theophilus is purely speaking metaphorically, but even metaphorically, the most perfect representation of anything is itself. The sky is heaven, and back in Revelation 6, these two perfect representations of God and man combine in an eclipse, which brings me back to my initial problem. So much of the Jesus resurrection story can be explained as an eclipse, but if the sun and moon fuse together, the perfect representation of God and the perfect representation of man, you have Jesus. Not only does the resurrection make sense as an eclipse, but Jesus Himself makes sense as an eclipse. I never intended or expected that astrology might explain Jesus, and quite frankly, this is beyond my scope. I'll continue researching this concept, but at this point it certainly appears that the eclipse of 59 CE was the birth of mythological Jesus. I have a great amount of concern for this path because it's so incredibly far from a modern Christian understanding. Still, I'll let my brain wander in that direction and see what I can find.